Go ahead and open your Bibles to John 18. We are going to be looking at first we're going to read a fairly large portion of the text, John 18, 28 through 40. And I just have a few comments to make before we get into it. I didn't write out a huge introduction, sometimes like I normally do, and that really wasn't planned like this, but I do just want to make a few comments about the text we're going to get ready to read. I think you're going to see this kind of shine through. I want to quickly explain the text that we're going to read. There's a lot of talk in here, and you'll see the implications in here as well of the truth. Pilate makes he has a mention of a phrase he says at the end. It's become very popular, and lots of sermons and things have been written on it. What is truth? And so you're going to see that theme throughout this. I don't know where my glasses are. I don't know how I'm going to do this without them. That's going to be fun. Anyway, I just realized that. So basically, you're going to see in the New Testament, the word truth, aletheia, is in there in the New Testament 98 times. There's some in the car actually. Sorry. 98 times in the New Testament, the word aletheia is in the New Testament. And so that means there's a heavy emphasis on the truth. John, of those 98 times, uses it 20 times in his gospel. So, and there's from multiple angles of looking at the truth found in this text. Like I said, some are implied, and some are directly spoken about. And this week, we're just going to look at the casual look of the attack on the truth from the standpoint of the religious hypocrites. Next week, we'll take a more formal look at the truth. And as we address Pilate's statements. So this week we're not going to really make it that far, but we're going to talk about the text, and we're going to see. There you go. Thank you. I think I had them somewhere around here recently. I felt like they were, but anyway, we're getting off subject. The hypocrites, the religious hypocrites of the day, and even of this day, build their false doctrines on their false narrative, and they promote themselves or their teachings. And so the relevance then is to help us to learn how to discern these false teachings, and that discernment is going to come through the understanding of the truth. It makes spotting these errors and these false doctrines a lot more easy. But mainly what we're going to see by the end of today is the Lord's sovereignty as it comes through and overcomes this hypocrisy. So let's go ahead and look at our text before us. We're in John 18, verses 28 through 40. We're just going to read through here real quick and get to it. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." So Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." And the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death," in order that the word of Jesus which he spoke would be fulfilled, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "Are you saying this from yourself, or did others tell you about me?" And Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation delivered, and the chief priests delivered you to me. What did you do?" And Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be delivered over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Therefore Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" And Jesus answered, "You yourself said I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." And Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to him, "I find no guilt in him, but you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish that I release for you the King of the Jews?" So they cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. So as I said, not a huge introduction today, but what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the truth here. Sorry, I'm getting my notes all mixed up here, but just a couple of small pages, and they're backwards. And yeah, we're good. There's mainly two big, large groups that are in this text. In verses 28 to 40, we're looking at the religious hypocrites, and we're going to see this in the first part. That's our talk today. Next time won't be next week because we'll have homecoming next week, but the week after we'll conclude it, and that'll give me plenty of time to look up all the things that I want to look up about this subject of the truth and look at that more formally, like I said, next time. So 2 weeks from now, we'll look at the end of this, the end portion. So we're going to be in verses 28 to 32. So you can mark a little parenthesis around that section if you want, and that'll help you kind of mark off portions of Scripture to isolate and really consider in your mind. All of this is talking about the battle for the truth, whether through the religious hypocrites or the suppression, I'm calling, of the skeptical sinners. That's what you'll see in the second go around. But this week we're looking at the religious hypocrites, because in verse 28 we see their outward appearance, their focus on this outward appearance of religiosity. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and for they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, look at here, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Well, this comes from religious teachings that really don't come from Scripture. I'm going to be getting a little ahead of myself. I have a note down here to talk about the Pharisees that came up this week, and I thought it was a good spot to put it in. The Pharisees actually were a group that actually came around after the return of the exiles from Babylon, stemming from Nehemiah's time and Ezra's time. And we're going through it on Wednesday nights. We're talking all about the idolatry of Israel leading up to the exile, and how they just could not shake this idolatrous worship of other gods and mixing it in with what they were supposed to be doing with God, with their own worship of the true God. And so now they come back from the exile, and their whole world has been destroyed, uprooted, and they were taken away. And you'll know that Daniel was one of those, and Ezekiel was in that time, and all this. So there's a lot that happened to Israel in this whole time frame, and now they've got this system, like this accountability program that they've come up with, that we're not ever going to do that again. And to their credit, Israel never did worship falsely, like false idols, as they had in the past. So there's maybe some pragmatism to their little system that they've developed. But now they've gone overboard, and they've gone farther than what's been said, to the point where they won't even go into Gentile homes, or they say that they can't go into Gentile homes because now they've become defiled, because they see Gentiles as a whole as defiled. And some of them had, and this comes from the idea that the pagans, the Gentile pagan nations, worshipped Molech and all these that would offer their babies and their children to sacrifice to the god. So they would say that there was dead babies. They might, if they go into a Gentile's home, they might come across a dead baby, and that would defile them because they couldn't be in the presence of anything that was dead or rotting. And so now they've taken this, and what they're doing is they're trying to have this outward appearance of I'm going to be religiously clean, but in their hearts they were as wicked and as polluted as you could imagine. They cared more about the small matters than they did than the large matters. Go to Matthew chapter 9 for a second. I want to show you something. This will show you their love over the law, or their lack of their love over the law. And as Jesus, this is Matthew 9, verse 9, and as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he stood up and followed him. Then it happened that Jesus was reclining at the table in the house, and behold, many tax collectors and sinners came. Now you know that the Jews had the lowest of low opinions of the tax collectors. In our day, we would probably see them as like liberals who go around aborting their babies, and these are the most loathsome people that they look down upon, and from Christianity's view in modern day, or from conservative views. So these are the low of the low, and then it happened, verse 10, that Jesus was reclining at the table, and behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were dining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why is your teacher eating with the tax collectors and sinners?" But when Jesus heard this, he said, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire compassion and not sacrifice, for I did not come to call the righteous, but to call sinners." You can go back to John. This is just an example of how and there's many such examples where they got on Jesus for healing someone because it was the Sabbath. They valued the laws of keeping the Sabbath over healing. And Jesus answered, "Well, look at what David did when his men were needing food. They ate from the temple." It's just amazing to me how the hypocrites, they're so focused on their programs. When these practices were instituted by the Lord, these ceremonies were there to build reverence to God. And like we would have for when we come together on Sunday nights and we usually sing, we do that because we just love to. And like when we went to the G3 conference and we were sitting there singing with all these people and tears rolling out of your eyes because you have a reverence, because you have such love for this whole thing. It's not like we're going there with this intention of, well, we're going to do this thing and that's going to put another major check mark on my scorecard. When I get to heaven, God's going to go, well, he attended 35 conferences. This guy is, talk about dedicated. That's not what it's about. It's about building their reverence to God. And instead, and like I said, and rightly so, they were trying to keep themselves from ever falling back into idolatrous worship, but they went way overboard. And that's the problem with legalists. You get stuck into that, and MacArthur rightly pointed out a long time ago, you show me a legalist, I will show you a hypocrite. And that's proven true every time I've really examined people. Listen to what Calvin says, commenting on verse 28. Short little comment. "It is usual with hypocrites to reckon it a greater crime to kill a flea than to kill a man." Such an interesting take on it. But look they bring no formal accusation, because not only is their appearance, they are so focused on their outward appearance, but they have outrageous arguments that's driven from their passions and their own desires. And it's ungodly desires. But they bring no formal accusation. Verse 29, "Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, 'What accusation do you bring against this man?' They had no accusation against him. They only have an end. Remember verse 28, look at the beginning, or in the middle of the verse. And it was early. They're the first ones to show up to court that day. The praetorium was the hall of justice. That's just the word they use. They call it the hall. Some versions have the judgment hall or the praetorium. They're the first ones to show up at the court on Friday morning. This is what you often see in, they're putting their desires out front. They have no accusation against him, or else they would have offered it right there. And we'll get to that in a second. But what they're doing is they're placing their desire out in front of the situation at hand. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to control the situation. They're trying to control the facts to affect the desired outcome that they're looking for. And what's their desire? They want to kill him, right? They want to bend the situation to conclude their desire. And they use facts incorrectly. They ignore other facts. And we're going to see more about that. They change the narrative. And I'm also talking about modern hypocrites that do exactly the same thing. They omit certain truth. They change the narrative or the history. And they only use half-truths to plant their lies in the midst of everything that they're talking about. I'll give you a great example of this. Christianity Today did a series last year, about a year ago, on a famous pastor and the fall of this famous pastor. 12 episodes on YouTube. You can look them up. It's called The Fall of Mars Hill. Very, very famous pastor in the Reformed world, and even in the early 90s. Well, he was from 96. Their church was from 96 to 2014. Wildly popular. His fall really, it began publicly, started really publicly in about 2013, or was it the early part of 2013 or 14, when he did a radio interview with Janet Medford, and she called him out on his newest book and said, she asked him why she just started a simple question and asked him why he didn't quote and cite as a footnote in his book who he was quoting. And he said, well, I did on this other page over here. And then he went on to say that he had the other author at his house. They were good friends, and him and his wife, they learned so much from him, and they ate together all the time, and they had dinner together all the time. And she just said, well, if he's such a good friend, then why, the right thing to do, especially as a writer, would be to give him credit. Well, and you think, well, that's one little thing, maybe he just made a mistake. Well, and she went to say, well, it was actually 14 pages of your book that you actually quote him outright, and you're just stealing his information. And what you've done, actually, you can be sued for, and you would lose. And she goes, if he was such a good friend, you would think he would give him credit. Well, and he kind of spun the situation, and I'm not really harping on him for that. It is what it is, and it actually, when it came out later on that many of his books were plagiarized, about 8 of them, I think, after that was found out. But that was the begin of his public fall, and all of a sudden it started coming out, all these different things, and his arrogance as it was displayed on the radio program. You could listen to it yourself, and his maneuvering around, and he starts bashing her for trying to trap him, which later on becomes a theme. His church reports start coming out that he's been manipulating them and abusing them. And church attendance dropped by the thousands. And he said back in a radio interview, or actually this is one of his sermons, I believe, one of his talks to his men's group, because he was really big on men's groups. So, by the way, I'm not getting my men's group inspiration from him, just so you know. This is his quote. There's a trail of bodies behind the Mars Hill bus. Those who are on the bus, they're not on their program of Mars Hill, they're getting kicked off. And if they're on the bus and then they think to themselves they want to drive, they're getting kicked off the bus. And he called it the blessed subtraction. that God was blessing them by subtracting those individuals who weren't on the bus to get kicked off. This is their pastor. In September 2014, Mars Hill and the 40 elders of the 15 different location churches, they were one of the first ones to start this multi-site thing back in the 90s and the early 2000s. 15 churches, 40 elders decided together that they were going to suspend him for a short time, and they wanted to figure out how they were going to restore him. They had a goal in their mind, was to bring him back to restoration. And Mark Driscoll, October 31st, 2014, him and his wife, they said that they were both individually in different rooms, and God told them that a trap was being set for them by the pastors and elders at Mars Hill, and so they left. 15 churches, every single one of them depended on his preaching, and all of them fell apart. He's now down in Arizona preaching. And recently, within this last year, he said that 3 or 4 of the elders came forward and told them that they had actually considered accusing him of adultery, which would have been false accusation, just to get him out. Except it wasn't true. The idea that they wanted him out to have someone else in their place was actually not true. How do we know that? Because in January 1st, just a couple of months later, Mars Hill as a whole, all 15 locations closed. They had no other plan. They actually wanted him back as their pastor. They loved him. They just didn't want him to go down this arrogant road. So why have I gone through all that? Because they tried to bring accountability to him. They tried to bring restoration to him. And he lied. He wanted to change the narrative as the Pharisees and the chief priests are doing. He wanted to avoid accountability as they'll do, and we'll see that in a second. And then he went to where those were charismatic churches because they take in those claims of God spoke to me. And it opens the door wide for guys like him to find a home there. And he's now doing it, and reports are now starting to come out from his new church about the same exact abuse that was happening in Mars Hill. It's very, very sad. The fallout has been tremendous. They did their last episode was 2.5 hours long, and they just interviewed people from Mars Hill. They're so hurt and so broken. Some of them couldn't even step foot in the church anymore because they felt how broken and hurt they have been. Mark Driscoll was reformed when the sovereignty of God was cool, when it was all the rage, when you can display your macho man talks and get up there and show guys how strong you are. When it didn't serve his purposes anymore, he became a charismatic and he needed a way out. And God spoke to him and he found refuge there. Now he's a charismatic and he speaks against the reform movement constantly. And you can see the chief priest narrative here is to promote their own agenda, not God's will. This is why I had the verse in Jeremiah read in the beginning. This is exactly what they're doing. They're promoting their own agenda. I quoted Calvin again. And such is the manner in which wicked men, who God has raised to a high degree of honor, blinded as it were by their own greatness, allow themselves to do whatever they choose. He's talking about this text right here. The chief priests, the Pharisees, and their narratives to do likewise, to promote their own agenda, and that's the death of Christ. They demand compliance based on their own words, and it's to disarm you. And that's what he did. And when I was talking about Mark Driscoll, the reason why he was speaking those things about what the elders they were going to lie was because he was trying to disarm his new congregation, because all of this stuff was coming out about him in Mars Hill. So now he's trying to disarm his new congregation from understanding the truth. Don't believe everything you hear. It's not that way. If it's not that way, then he would have a great case against Christianity today. I mean, they did a 12-part message on them, and he could easily refute them and go back if it was true. But look at verse 30. And they answered, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." You don't need a formal accusation. Of course we're here on our good merit. We're not going to bring a guy that's innocent before you. Seriously. That's to disarm you of your discernment. That's to make you let go. You can trust me. I've heard recently teachers say, don't worry about everything all the questions that are going to pop up in your mind. Just hear out the whole teaching and then make your judgment at the end of it. That's to disarm you from your discernment that's going to pop up throughout the entire talk. Every time you hear something that disagrees with what you've heard previously in Scripture, you're going to be going, well, wait a minute. No, I'm supposed to not listen to those arguments. I'm supposed to hear the whole talk through. That's exactly what's happening here. If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. You got to trust us on this. So, the hypocrites are heavily focused on their outward appearance of their righteousness and holiness, right? And their outrageous arguments are driven by a man-centered theology. Make no mistake about it. Their religiosity is for silencing critics. And that's those of sound doctrine who can refute their lies. And the focus of their religion is very much man-centered. Look at what we've done. Look at what we are. Washed hands, right? They got washed hands. Jesus, why don't your disciples wash their hands? Well, that just drives us to our third point. Because the first two is they're outrageous. I forgot already. Outrageous appearance and their offensive argument, or the outrageous argument now to their offensive anti-religious. Their hypocrisy is offensive even to the anti-religious, or even we could call them the atheists. Let's read verse 30 and 31 again. They answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." And what does Pilate say? "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." And no charge from them, no formal charge. And they insist that Pilate act. But he sees through their facade. The statement that he makes in verse 31, Pilate's statement, is a mocking statement. If it was up to you guys, he'd be dead already. He knows what they're doing. It's easy to see. They have no charges. They're the first ones in the door, which means they must have been doing something during the night. And anyone in his system would know how the Jewish systems work. They're not supposed to have those trials at night. And yet here they are, first thing in the morning. They're ready to rock. Because you'd think that the biggest Pharisees and the chief priests in town would be most focused on, not on some little criminal who has been blasphemous. What are they focused on? It's Passover, baby. Right? This is the big event. You got 2 million people. They're sleeping on the countryside outside of Jerusalem. And you're worried about this guy? That's your big concern? You have the high priest, Caiaphas, walks in the door. That's like having the Pope of Rome walk in. And he's like, look, we got to take care of this today. This is Christmas morning. I get it. And service is about to start. But we got to make sure this guy gets roasted. So Pilate sees. And he says to them, take him yourselves and judge him. He knows what they would do to a blasphemer. What happens to a blasphemer? Kill him, right? So they pretend like they care about the rules and the law. Well, we can't do that. It's not lawful for us to judge a man to death, because that's what Roman law said, that they weren't allowed to kill a man. Rome was good about coming into their countries and taking over, but Rome also saw the benefit and the value of keeping their own cultures intact to the degree that the economy wouldn't collapse. And so Rome didn't mind them having their own religious systems kept in place. But the one thing they weren't going to do was let them become their own judges. And they were going to have to go to Rome when they want someone killed. And that was the law. So they quote the law correctly here. But this is all, and this is the same as the other thing. It's all for show. And when this doesn't work, Mark 15 tells us, and the chief priest began accusing him of many things. Didn't work on Pilate. He didn't change his mind. Oh, I guess you're right. You guys can't do anything about it. Okay, come on, bring him on. Let's go. Let's get this thing over with. No. Mark 15 proves that it didn't work. The chief priest accused him of many things. What many things? Let's turn to Luke chapter 20. And you'll see what the many things are. Verse 19. We're going to read a little section here, and we'll see what these many things were. And the scribes and the chief priests had tried to lay hands on Jesus. This is before this time. We're not here at the praetorium anymore. We're out in the about. The chief priests and scribes tried to lay hands on him that very hour, but feared the people, for they understood that he spoke this parable against them. We're not going to go into the parable. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be righteous. Notice, these are false defectors from the Pharisees. Men that would go and pretend to be defecting from the Pharisaical realm and becoming, quote, disciples, so that they might catch him in some statement in order to deliver him to the rule and authority of the governor. They're plotting this thing out. And they questioned him, these false defectors, and saying, Teacher, we know that you speak and teach correctly, and you are not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, maybe he had this very statement in mind, this very trial in mind, Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have? They said, Caesar's. And he said to them, Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were unable to catch him in a word in the presence of the people. And marveling at his answer, they became silent. I'll go back to John. Well, what was the... I'll tell you real quickly, though. Well, I almost got ahead of myself there. Think about it. These are likely the same guys that are standing in front of him. And actually, Luke does confirm that later on in the gospel. They're standing there accusing him, saying these things against him. Oh, that's not what he said about Caesar and his taxes. Trying to get Pilate riled up about it. Oh, wait a minute. This guy is causing a revolution against our king, our Caesar. Remember what Jesus said to the high priest last week we talked about. I've been out here in the temple doing these things and saying these things. Ask the people who have heard my teachings. You know what I've said. It's all not true. But listen to the reaction in Mark 15 about this. Pilate asked Jesus, Have you no answer to make to their accusations? See how many charges they bring against you? But Jesus made no further answer, so that that Pilate was amazed. He saw through their deception, their wickedness. And he's saying, Why aren't you saying anything, Jesus? What are you doing? You see these accusations they're bringing against you. Why aren't you saying anything? John 19 confirms this. John 19, verse 12. Pilate sought to release him. He's struggling as an agnostic guy. He doesn't know if this guy Jesus standing in front of him is really God or not. There's one very sad word that we read in one of the Gospels, and I forget which one it is now, where it says that Jesus and Pilate refused, Jesus was refusing to talk, and Pilate gets afraid because now he knows the trap is set and Pilate's at the center of it. The whole thing is going to pivot on him. So he says in verse 31, back in John, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. And they pretend to hold honor and reverence for the law of Caesar. But they didn't really have that honor in the law for Caesar, did they? Because in Acts 6, when Stephen was accused of blasphemy, what did they do? They stoned him right there on the spot. So they didn't really have that. But listen to what God says about hypocrites in Psalm 64, before Jesus' time. 64 verse 5, they hold fast to their evil purpose. Verse 6, they search out injustice. And then in our verse that we read this morning, Jeremiah 26:11, then the prophets and the priests said to the officials, to all the people, this man, Jeremiah, deserves the sentence of death because he has prophesied against this city, as you have heard with your own ears. And Jeremiah's prophecy contradicted what their prophets were saying, because his prophecy was from God and their prophecy was not from God. Much like our modern hypocrites. They refuse correction. Driscoll. They refuse rebuke. I think of elders and pastors that I've known in the past. And I remember one pastor's wife saying, I've had a team of my closest partners and accountability partners assess me, and they didn't find fault in me. I'm good. This was, and while she's accusing a couple that was no longer in the church in a business meeting while they weren't there. I found myself to be free from sin in this situation. And once they're filled with that kind of pride, there's often no way back. They're filled with they're buying their own hype. As Matthew 19 says, I think it may apply. Jesus said, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. I think that would include those that are rich on their own pride. So the big question on the table is, they had what they wanted in claiming his blasphemy. Right? But it's false, because if he's claiming to be God and he really is God, then it's not blasphemous. They have what they want, though. So why don't they just stone him like they did Stephen later on? Because the Lord is sovereign. While foolishness rules unbelievers like that, and the truth is obfuscated, God still rules, right? Nothing happens that surprises him. And this is the reason why Jesus remained silent. Like a lamb, he was led to the slaughter, right? And this all for a purpose. Flip over to Galatians 3, not 9, verse 9. And we're going to end here and talk about this for a second. This is Galatians chapter 3, verse 9. We're just going to kind of walk through a few verses real quick. And I'll make a few comments and then we'll end. This statement made in verse 9, short little statement. So then, those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham, the believer, right? The believers in Christ are identified here with Abraham's blessing. So look at verse 10. For as many are as the works of the law, they are under a curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all the things written in the book of the law and do them. My mind went to Jacob and Esau. Remember when Jacob got the blessing from his father, Isaac? He tricked him into getting it, right? But he got the blessing. And Esau begged, what about me? Give me a blessing too, right? And Jacob says, well, I already gave it to, Isaac says, I already gave it to your brother. And Esau cried because he wanted the blessing. And then he ended up getting a curse because he kept pushing his father. And Now, my mentioning this is not to really focus too heavily on that, and you should go read those sections if you think that was unfair. But what we're seeing here is those who identify with Christ are under the blessing. Those who identify with a works-based system, works-based way of earning your salvation, you're under the curse of Esau, where you get no blessing. And Paul starts talking about that here. If you're going to go by works or any method, you're finished before you start, because you got to be able to keep all of the works. You have to be able to keep all of the law every day, every moment, from birth to death, every single breath of a moment of your life. You have to have perfect attendance, perfect record. You have to be able to show up on Judgment Day and say, "Yep, kept the whole thing. I got it, man. I was fearful in that last moment, but I was wrong, and I kept it all the way through my life." That's not possible. We all know that, right? And Paul even says that. Verse 11, "Now no one is justified by the law before God is evident, for the righteous shall live by faith." And he proves it in verse 12. "However, the law is not of faith, because you can't keep it. He who does them shall live by them." In other words, to say everything I just said, you have to be able to keep it from the moment you're born to the moment you take your last breath and you pass from here to heaven. You have to be able to keep the entire law. If you break it even one time, you're guilty of the whole thing, and you go to hell. There's only one man that did that, right? But the righteous shall live by faith. And the righteous are believers. It's in verse 9. He calls us believers. Believers live by faith. Verse 11. Faith in what? Just mere belief in God? Because the average person is going to say, "I believe in God. I'm pretty good." What does that communicate? What does it communicate when someone says, "I believe in God"? It says, "I'm a good person. See, look at me. I believe. That's my good deed. I have the belief. I'm a good boy." So then how does someone become righteous if they can't do it, and it's impossible to get your own righteousness? If you can't keep all the laws and you can't do it yourself, how do you get there? Verse 13. "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree.'" Christ perfectly able and willing took on the punishment of man. Christ, be very careful to hear this statement, by taking on our curse, he did not become a sinner. He did not become cursed in himself. Because if he had become cursed in himself, he would no longer be God. And everything of him was perfect. But he willingly took on the curse, as Philippians 2 says, as Isaiah 53 says. Everything that we have seen today is happening to an innocent man. Remember, that's been the whole point of our argument, our talk today, and everything that we're talking about. Jesus is innocent. And all this is being placed onto him. And he could defend himself, but he doesn't. He did that so the blessing, verse 14, in order that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we would receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. What is the blessing of Abraham? Look at verse 8. We didn't read that verse. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify Gentiles by faith. I wonder how he did that. Through Jesus, right? Proclaim the gospel to Abraham beforehand, saying, all nations will be blessed in you. So we're being connected to that as believers by believing that. Jesus was the promised blessing. He was the one that was going to come and rescue us, to do what we couldn't do, to bridge that gap that we could never cross, to do the impossible by the impossible, because we can't keep the law, we can't become righteous on our own, and we believe that. And we believe what God has done. That's what the gospel is. Believing what God has done. And for the unbelieving world, hypocritical people and religious pretenders, it's not too late. And that's why we preach the gospel. Let's bow our heads in prayer.